Hello, welcome to the fourth part of the Document Understanding Solution Architecture video series. So in the previous video, we looked at the config file, how to set it up and how to configure it. And we also went through the config file to understand the different sheets available in it and see how it is used. So in this video, we'll look at the document understanding framework and check few components to see how it is configured and how it is being used. So to start with, let's have a look at the attended and the unattended flows. So in the framework, these are the two main workflows that we have. The main attended XML file is used for the attended automation. The action center one is used for the unattended one. Both have a lot of similarities, but there are slight changes. So to start with, let's look at the arguments. So in the arguments panel, in the attended workflow, we have two input arguments. One is the target file, and the other one is a Boolean argument that says whether we are using a queue or not. So through the target file, you can actually give a file path and run it only for that path, for that file. Using the queue, if you set it to false in the attended workflow, it will give you a prompt to check whether you have a selected file. So basically in that prompt, you can select the file that you want to run and execute it. So those are the two methods you can run the attended workflow. Similarly, in the unattended workflow, the action center workflow, you have the same two arguments. So even the action center workflow can be triggered for a specified file, or else you can have this queue defined. So by default, because it is the unattended workflow, you have the use queue argument enabled or set to true because it is unattended. But however, if you want to run this unattended flow for a specified file, you can actually provide it through this input argument. So to start with, let's look at the other options we have in the attended workflow. So these are the two arguments that we have. And this read config file, this invoked workflow is common across both. You can see it is the same workflow that is invoked in both workflows. So let's quickly have a look. So in here, if you look at the input arguments, you can see it is the default config file path, and we are also providing all the sheets that we need to read. So ideally in the read config file, what happens is the bot will read all the available fields in the config file and load it into a dictionary, the config dictionary. It's the same thing that happens in the RE framework. It's the same workflow. We are using it for document understanding, but here we have extra set of sheets. So as we discussed in the previous video, for each document type, we thought of having a separate sheet with the validations and the mandatory fields and so on. So the only difference here is we are using those sheets as well. So those are the arguments. And let's quickly have a look at the workflow. So in here we have a couple of output arguments. We are defining the dictionary and then we are defining the log key. It is a new GUI ID. And then for each sheet, we will be looping through the sheets and we will be reading the data and loading everything into a dictionary. So that's what happens in this simple workflow. And down here, we will also add this max attempts and retry intervals for the retry scope. And also for the retry scopes, we need to define how many times you need to attempt it. So we can use this max attempt max execution attempts that is defined in the config file to configure our activities. So these are the results we send out to the main workflow, whether it's the action center or the attended. So that's all we have in the read config file. Now, there is a small difference in the attended and the unattended version for the next activity. So here you can see for the attended one, we have an if condition. So let's quickly have a look at it. So here in the if condition, what happens here is we have a condition that checks whether we are using the queue, and also this input target file argument is set to null or empty. So if the input queue is set to false, and if this is also null, then we show this prompt for the user to select the document. So it's like a file selection window that we usually see. It's shown because both of these are empty. And so that's the extra step we have in the attended workflow. So this is only applicable for attended version because in the attended one, it usually runs in the computer that user is working. In the unattended workflow, we don't have that option. We directly go into this try catch, and here we start executing the workflow since we have all the information. So coming back to attended. So while we are explaining, we are also doing a little comparison of these workflows. And here we have the try catch, and then we have the initialize part. So again, this initialize workflow is common for both. So here we pass the assets and the config file path and few other arguments along with the document taxonomy as the output. So let's quickly have a look at the initialization part. So in here, we have a retry scope. So earlier we actually got that max retries and those configurations as the output. So if you look at this retry scope, you can actually see that those are being used here, as I explained before. So in the initialize process, the main thing that happens is you load the taxonomy into the workflow, and then you actually read the assets sheet from the config file. So the asset sheet is actually read separately from the read config file path. So in the load taxonomy, it's the default activity, but if you actually look at the taxonomy manager, we can see the default configurations. So in the default document understanding framework, they have set several document types here. So under documents, you have certificate of filing. Then under semi-structured documents, you have invoices, receipts. And under structured documents, you have the W9 lending forms. So the defined taxonomy will be sent out as an output argument from the initialized process workflow. And here the assets will be read and the values available in the assets will be used or added into the config file and will be used across the workflow. So these are the main things that happen in the initialize process. In addition to that, if you have any extra initialization code that is required, you can invoke that information over here. The best practice is you can write the initialization code in separate workflows and invoke it here so that you keep the workflow tidy and simple. So that's the initialize process. And that's how we load the taxonomy. And That will be loaded into both Action Center and the attended workflow depending on which workflow you are running. So once you are done with that, let's look at the attended workflow because we are following that, but it is the same across the unattended one as well. The next step is to check whether you are using the queue or not. So this is defined in the input argument. So if this is set to false, this will directly go here into the next decision point to check whether our target file is empty or not. So if it's the attended workflow, the file path that you provide over here, this will be assigned directly to that input argument as you see here in the screen. So if the user defines it, this argument will get the file path that user selects. And if you are using the queue, it will go to the get transaction item workflow and get the next transaction item available from the queue. Let's quickly have a look at the unattended flow as well. It is exactly the same over here. We check whether we are using the queue. If not, we check whether the input target file is empty or not. So in the unattended scenario, we don't have a prompt that allows the user to select the file path. In the unattended workflow, what happens is when you are triggering the workflow from orchestrator, we have an option to provide this file path in the job creation. So that's where user can provide that. And user can set this to false if the user wants to trigger it only for that file. So that's how these two work for the unattended. So now let's have a look at the get transaction item. So this is very much the same as what you see in the RE framework, but here we have few extra things. In the document understanding flow, we have the retry scope as usual, and inside that we have the get transaction item to get the next available transaction item into a out transaction item argument, which is a queue item. And then we are actually checking few things. So in the transaction item, we are checking whether this is empty or not. So this is the default check whether to see whether the queue has any new items to process or not. If this is empty, we will send out a message saying it is empty. If it is not, here we are checking few extra things. We are checking, so this is the condition. So the out transaction item is not nothing. That means it has something, a new transaction item. But we are checking the out transaction item specific content has the target file key. We are checking whether it is available or not. So basically, in our previous workflow or the previous video, we mentioned that the the queue item should have the transaction name defined properly. So in the config file, we have the transaction file key. So that name has to be available as it is in the queue item. So that name will be used to hold the file path. So that's exactly the one that we are looking at. So in the Excel file, the target file key is defined in the settings sheet. So this is the key and this is the name that we are looking for. So this name, what you define here, has to be available as it is in the queue specific content. If you want to change this, you can change it in the config file and use the same name in the queue item. And that will be used across your document understanding workflow. So that's the condition we have for this else if part. So we are checking for the transaction item and also the availability of that specific content. And in the else section, here we are checking whether we are actually taking the target file key from the transaction item and assigning it to the out target file argument, which is a string. So this argument will actually hold the file path to the target document that is going to be processed. And in addition to that, all the content available in the transaction item under specific content will be added to the config file, so you can easily use them across your workflow. So those are the extra things that happen in the get transaction item. This is not available in the RE framework because that is used for a different purpose. But here it is the same transaction item, but here we have extra steps to specially work on those documents. So this is how the get transaction item workflow works. And it is the same for both again. So once you have the transaction item, if you look at the output argument, the transaction item is coming in as a queue item over here. And also the target file will be sent out separately, and that will be assigned to the target file, the input argument of this main workflow. So both will be sent out from the get transaction item. So this in target file will be used across the entire workflow. So it is important that this argument, it has a value either through the queue or through the user interface or through the argument itself. So those are the three ways this argument get assigned. So now we know up to this point how we get the data, how we get the file path, whether we are using the queue, and whichever the approach we use, whether the data is available, and then you actually start the document understanding part. So it is the same for attended and for unattended. So next comes the digitizing part. So from there we'll continue in another video. So that's it for this part of the video, and if you have any questions or if you still see that anything is not clear, feel free to drop a comment and I will reply to you, or you can reach out to me directly. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video for the digitizing part. Have a good day.